Hey everyone, welcome to another processing video. My name is Jesse and today I'm going to show you how I create time-lapse footage using a sequence of images that I took with my DSLR camera over a long period of time, and I'm going to show you how to go from this to this. Now you'll notice that that sequence was shot looking directly at the sun at sunset, and these are the most difficult sequences to shoot. Now I'm not going to actually talk about how to shoot the time-lapse itself. I have written a blog article that describes the whole process, and you might get some helpful information out of that, so I'm going to include that in the description if you're interested in learning more about how to actually shoot the time-lapse. Now fortunately we have software that allows us to smooth out the changes in brightness and to deflicker any flicker that was created during the shoot of the time-lapse. And LR time-lapse works by working in conjunction with Lightroom. So it allows us to edit keyframes in our photo sequence, and then it automatically makes adjustments between those keyframes and applies it to those raw files. So that's a key. We have to shoot in RAW when we shoot these sequences in order to get the best quality in our video. Now once you've edited your RAW files in LR time-lapse and Lightroom, you're going to need a way to bring it all together into a video, and I use Adobe After Effects. So I'm going to be showing you how to use those three programs in conjunction with each other to create the final result. So let's go ahead and get right into it, and we'll start in LR time-lapse. So first things first, we're going to go into LR time-lapse, and I've already loaded up my sequence here. It's 332 images, and at 30 frames per second, it's going to end up being 11 seconds long. LR time-lapse gives you a lot of data, a lot of different details, and you really don't need to know any of this. Fortunately, LR time-lapse is very user-friendly, and the workflow follows a very logical order. And the creator of LR time-lapse actually has tutorial videos that are very helpful on his website that I would very much recommend checking out. And I should mention that I'm using LR time-lapse version 4.83. I think the most current version is 5, but I just haven't upgraded yet. Everything should still be the same, more or less, though. So the workflow, we want to go to the visual, make sure we're in the visual workflow tab. And the workflow, as I said, is very logical and easy to follow. We're just going to go from step 1, 2, 3. We're just going to follow the order of these buttons. So I'm going to click the keyframes wizard, and what that's going to do is create keyframes throughout the sequence that we're going to edit. And then LR time-lapse is going to make adjustments between each of those keyframe sequences to smooth out the transitions. And the number of keyframes that you want to create depends on the number of changes, or rather the changes in the amount of light throughout the time-lapse sequence. If you have a lot of changes, then you want to make more keyframes. So I'm going to make about 9 for this sequence, and the keyframes are indicated by these blue diamonds. Each of these is going to be a chance to change the exposure settings on my RAW files. So I'm going to save that, and since I shot this in manual mode and changed the settings throughout, I'm going to use the Holy Grail wizard, because what the Holy Grail wizard does is it equalizes the steps in brightness throughout the sequence. And what you want to pay attention to is this orange line here, this orange graph in the preview. I can't tell you what that does exactly, but I can tell you that we want that line to intersect this middle yellow line here as best as possible. And these sliders here allow you to adjust that line to get it as close as possible to being straight and down the middle. So that right there is about as good as I'm going to get with that line, so I'm going to hit save, which again, you're going to follow the steps, and saving is the next step in the process. Now you'll notice the next button here says drag to Lightroom. That means we're going to go into Lightroom and we're going to edit those keyframes. Now I've already got Lightroom loaded up here. So this is my entire sequence, and what I want to do is make sure that I'm in the library tab, and then I'm going to hit Control+A to select everything in that sequence. And then I want to go to metadata and then read metadata from files, because that's going to read the data that was put into it by LR Time-lapse, and that's how these two programs communicate. So while that is progressing, I can go ahead and I'm going to go down here to the filters, and I'm going to choose LRT for keyframes, and that's just going to show the keyframes that were created by LR Time-lapse. And these keyframes are indicated by the stars. It's going to be the ones with the 4 stars. So I'm going to select the first one in the sequence and go to develop, and then I'm going to develop, or rather change the exposure settings as I normally would. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring my highlights down so I can bring back some of the sky, and then I'm going to bring my darks, my blacks up, because if you look at the histogram here, the histogram shows that some of the blacks are clipped as indicated by this white triangle here at the top. So if I move the black slider over, you can see that clears out that triangle. And so that restored my blacks. I'm going to bring the shadows up just a little bit, and the whites will bring out some of the vibrancy in the foreground. And as I adjust the whites, I'm going to bring the highlights down, because again, up here I'm looking at the highlights, and they are now clipped after bringing up the whites. And I'm going to adjust the contrast just a little bit, because if you bring up the contrast a lot, for some reason it doesn't play very nicely with LR Time-lapse. Adjust my saturation. Usually I bring it up to about between 25 and 30. And you can also bring up the vibrance a little bit. Vibrance is pretty much the same as saturation, but it adjusts the most muted colors in the picture first. Now my white balance when I shot this was, I believe, set on automatic settings. And you can do that. You can just have your white balance set on automatic and have the camera adjust that for you, or you can adjust the white balance yourself. Now we're going to apply these settings to the next image in the sequence. So I'm going to hit shift and left click down here on the next image, and then I'm going to go to scripts, sync keyframes, and that's going to apply all of the settings that we made to the next one in the sequence. And I'm going to look at that and see if I need to change anything, but the exposure looks pretty good to me there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and apply that to the next 3 images, because I don't think it changes much from there. And again, I'm going to shift and left click on those to select them all at the same time, go up to the top to scripts and sync keyframes again. I'm just going to deselect that, and I'm going to go to the third one in the sequence and see how that looks and compare it with my last one. As the sun goes down, we are going to have to bring the exposure up a little bit. So at this point I'm going to bring the exposure up a little, just a little, and the highlights back down to compensate. I'm also going to bring the saturation down just a tad, because the colors in the sunset are becoming a little overwhelming here. I'm going to bring my whites down a little too, so that they're not clipped here. I I think I want to go back a little bit and probably change my white balance. I'm going to make it a little bit cooler. And again, I'm going to apply that change to the next one. And again, the next one to see what that looks like. Now here I'm going to make the white balance just a little bit warmer. And the whites are clipped again. I'm going to bring them down, but everything else looks fine to me, so I'm going to apply that to the next image in the sequence. And since it's getting darker, I can bring my blacks down a little bit to indicate that. My whites are clipped again. I'm going to bring them down just a little bit farther. And I think I'm going to bring my white balance up a little bit again. Now this is the sunset's finishing up, so I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit too and apply that to the last image. That should be good. Alright, so now that we've changed the develop settings, we need to apply that to the metadata so that it reflects those changes in LR time-lapse. So again, I'm going to go to the library tab, the library module, and select all of my images in the sequence, go to metadata, and this time I'm going to save metadata to files. And then I'm going to bring up LR time-lapse again. Now, so we went through the drag to Lightroom step, and the next step in the sequence is reload, so that's going to reload the new data that we input into that sequence. And then I'm going to go to auto transition, and that's going to apply rather smooth the transitions between the keyframes that we edited, and it's going to apply that transition throughout everything else in the sequence. And then again, I'm going step by step. I'm going to save that. Then I'm going to generate visual previews when that's finished, and that's going to take a few minutes usually to do. Alright, after the previews have loaded, we can hit this play button here to see what it's going to look like. And this is without all of the final editing applied. So that looks good to me. And now we can move on to the next step, which is visual deflicker. If you did not shoot with an automatic lens, this won't show up as an option. And visual deflicker will create the flicker that's created with automatic lenses where there is a slight difference in exposure between shots. So this is one of the ways that we can correct for it if we're not using a manual lens. Generally, using a visual deflicker with this slider around 10 works pretty well for me. I think this green line is supposed to be more or less smooth. And I know that you can apply too much smoothing, and I believe that'll actually introduce flicker, so I generally try to keep it around 10 or less. After I apply that, then I'm going to go to the final button in the sequence and hit save. And now that's going to generate another visual preview with all of the editing and visual deflicker applied to the sequence. And that'll allow us to preview it. And then what we'll do is we'll go into Lightroom again and apply all of those changes to the entire sequence. From there we can export the raw files as JPEGs and put them together into the final video using Adobe After Effects. So I'm just going to let this visual preview continue. You have to let the previews continue all the way, because it's not just generating a preview for you, it's also applying all of those settings to all of the images. The visual preview with editing is finished, and now we can play that to see what it looks like. And that looks good. It actually looks like it might be a little better than my original video. So from here, I'm just going to bring up Lightroom again. I'm going to click anywhere to deselect everything in that sequence. And then I'm going to go over here and turn all the filters off. Now I want to select all by hitting Control plus A on the keyboard. And go up here to metadata. And I want to read metadata from files because I want the changes that we made, or rather the LR time-lapse made for us, I want those to be applied to the entire sequence. Alright, now that that's finished, I'm going to keep everything selected, and then I'm going to right click anywhere on any of these and go to export, and we're going to export these as JPEGs. And it's the JPEGs that's going to be used to put together, that's going to be put together into the time-lapse sequence. And I'm going to select the folder that I'm going to put these in. I'm going to put these into a different folder here from my last images that I exported. Here's all of the settings that you need. You need to make sure that JPEG is selected. You want the quality to be 100% and the color space to be sRGB. You want the image sizing to be 96 pixels per inch because 96 ppi is the maximum resolution that you can see with most computer monitors. And if you go any higher than that, then you're just making your file sizes unnecessarily large. And I'm going to change my output sharpening. I'm going to sharpen it to screen, and I'm just going to use the standard amount of sharpening because when you export to JPEG, then the process itself softens the images a little bit, so you have to kind of apply that sharpening to bring it back a little bit. And I'm going to export those when I have all those settings in place. So I'll allow that to run, and then we will pick this up in Adobe After Effects. Okay, all of my JPEGs have been exported, and now I'm going to load up Adobe After Effects here, and the start screen we can just close out of it. And this is very simple from here. What I do is over in this panel here, I will double click and I'll go to the folder that contained my JPEGs. I'll select the first image in the sequence, and then you want to make sure that importer JPEG sequence is selected. And if you had to delete anything within this sequence, then you also want to make sure that force alphabetical order is also applied. So I'm going to click import. So that is going to import all of my JPEGs as a sequence. And after I do that, I want to go over here, left click, or right click rather, and go to interpret footage, main. And this is where I'm going to select my frame rate. The frame rate is already 30 frames per second. I can also do 24. 24 is what I do a lot of times with time-lapse because it just allows for the time-lapse to go longer. I can go longer and not shoot as many pictures. So I'll just choose 24 frames per second. And then I'm going to drag my sequence over here to the Create Composition button in that panel. And that's going to bring up a new composition. So the composition that is loaded up here is going to default to the native dimensions of the JPEGs that you imported. And mine is something like 7,000 by 4,000 pixels. That's basically equivalent to 7K. What I want to do is I want to make a 4K video out of this sequence. So I'm going to go over here to my composition that's selected, right click and go to composition settings. We're just going to change the settings, the dimensions here to fit the 4K video format. And I just use the presets here. You can set your own dimensions if you would like, but I use the presets because these are friendly with all the social media sites. So I'm going to use those settings, and I want to adjust the frame rate here. The frame rate defaults to 23.976, but we are going to do 24 frames per second as I chose when I interpreted the footage in the beginning. And so you're going to see that that resizes the entire composition. And so it's going to crop out a lot of the stuff in your image, but we can resize that to include everything on the side. So I'm going to take this corner here and I'm going to shift and click on it. Let me try that again. Shift click. And that's going to allow me to resize this while maintaining the aspect ratio. And you want to resize it so that these the selection line is just outside of the composition. So when you create your video, it's just going to include what's inside of here now. This is finished and it's ready to render out. You can also preview what you've done. However, whenever you load previews in Adobe After Effects, if I go down here to the timeline and hit space to run the preview, you can see this green line, this green progress bar slowly inching forward, and that's because if you preview a time-lapse sequence, then it has to render everything within that sequence, and that takes a lot of time. And I've got the preview resolution set to a quarter rather than a full. If you have it set at full, it's going to take it even longer to render the preview. But if you want to see what it looks like, you have to just let that render out entirely. But I'm not going to let this load out all the way. I know what the preview is going to look like, but I can stop it by hitting space, and I can run the preview through this green area here within the progress bar that's already been rendered, and you can see what that looks like here. But if you had questions about what the rest of the sequence would look like, you can let that go ahead and render out. So I'm going to save this project file, and I'm going to go to Save As here. I'll just put it in my new folder that I created, and I'll just name that Sunset Gorge. And I can even actually name my composition as well. If you have multiple compositions, that might be helpful. I'll just name it Sunset. I'm going to save that again. And this can actually be rendered out in Adobe After Effects, but I like to use the media encoder that's included with Adobe Creative Cloud. And if you're subscribed to Adobe Creative Cloud, the media encoder should be included at no extra cost. I can close out of that and bring up media encoder. And I'm just going to navigate here in the media browser to where I saved that project file. And there we have the Sunset Gorge project that I saved earlier. And I'm going to right click and import that into media encoder, and it's going to come up here and ask us to select a composition. We only have that one composition, so I'm going to select it and hit OK, and that brings it over here into the queue. For 4K video, I just use this preset here for YouTube 4K, and that plays nicely with all the other social media outlets as well, and including Facebook. However, I found that with Instagram I have to use the 1080p setting. But we'll select that, and you want to make sure that the codec that is used is H.264. This is one of the most commonly used codecs for 4K and HD video, so it's compatible with a lot of different things, and so generally that's the one that you want to use. And I can click that and select the file name. I can give it whatever name I want and hit save, and so once I'm ready I can just hit this play button and that'll start rendering what we have in the queue here, which is just this video, and that will take several minutes to run through. So that will conclude this video, and I hope that you found it informative. I'll leave the end of the video with the sequence that I just created at the end so you can see what that looks like. And if you did find this informative and you would like to donate to my Patreon, then I will include a link to that below in the description. Also, check me out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, all that good stuff. And so I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks.